my talk is called The Bogus Refugee and Auto-ethnography of Migration. The plan I have here is to talk about post-Soviet Eastern European migrants in academic literature, defining class as a sociological concept, learning English not as talk. I am writing a paper on this that I'm submitting to a journal on migration and decolonialism in Canada. So this is just, I'm just going to share basically my own, as well as what the literature says about people who migrated from the same part of the world as me. So literature on migration from Eastern Europe seems to go into two different clusters, right? The first one is basically describing the post-Soviet migrant, which, so like if you see here literature from 2006 up to the current year, they all describe who the migrant is from Eastern Europe, how do they look like, what kind of occupations they do, especially as it pertains to women, right, to gender. We see this in all kinds of literatures on migration, right, as it pertains to people migrating from the so-called Latin America, from African countries, from Asian countries, and so on and so forth, describing the migrant, describing the other. And then a second cluster that seems to be more recent, like 2010 to current times, to the last 10 years, focuses basically on post-Soviet migration to North America. And this is my own interest because I am from the former Soviet Union and I migrated to US and to Canada. So I would like to take this time to basically reflect on my own migration, as well as start a discussion on how Eastern Europeans adhere or refuse to adhere to the concept of whiteness. All right, so to share my own story, on my first day in the United States, my sister, who has been living in Seattle for a decade, took me to work with her, cleaning white middle-class people's homes. I was confused, not because of the hard physical labor, it was hard, but because I did not know what she did for a living. Also, 10 days before, I was a university student in Moldova, the place of my birth. My sister would send me remittances to buy things other than for survival, such as sanitary napkins, which were a luxury for people with my background. I come from a working class background. A working class person in the post-Soviet Moldova may not have been able to afford sanitary napkins, but I was going to university. In the United States, my sister had a house, a car, and access to sanitary pads while working as a cleaning person for middle-class white people. I quickly understood that class works differently in the United States than in Eastern Europe. My cleaning career only lasted a week. As a non-English speaker, I could not read the labels on cleaning products and ruined a white lady's kitchen table. She called my sister, inquiring how come her 19-year-old sister does not know how to clean. I never met this lady. I was cleaning while she was doing her middle-class job. Her assumption about my lack of cleaning skills left me feeling dejected. The next day, my sister enrolled me in ESL classes. In ESL classes, one is treated paternalistically, as a child who has yet to learn, as lacking, as if whatever languages one may speak are discardable, By the way, I speak Romanian, which is my first language, Russian, as well as French. This made me think about colonial indigenous language erasure. And this was not the first time my language was considered inadequate. I was born during the last leg of the Soviet Union in Moldova. The Russians imposed not only their language, but also their alphabet upon us. My parents and siblings went to school writing Romanian, the language of my people, with Cyrillic letters. Just briefly, for historical context, Moldova is an Eastern European state formed in 1991 as a result of the dismantling of the Soviet Union. Moldova came under Soviet rule in 1940 due to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Before 1940, for a brief period of 22 years, Moldova was part of the Kingdom of Romania. In the 19th century, Moldova fell under the rule of the Russian Empire, and before that, the region was under the Ottoman Empire from the 16th to the 19th centuries. I was the first generation in my family to use the Latin alphabet, read Romanian authors, but also develop a smoldering hatred towards the Russian state. My birth certificate, Cyrillic alphabet / Romanian language, non-consensual concoction is testament to this. It declares me a subject of the Soviet Union. I was 4 years old when Moldova declared independence. My people have been crossed by borders so many times, sometimes within the same generation, that allegiance to a state is often questioned. The first time I heard my folks talk about migration, I was in grade 8, 14 years old. As any teenager, I was worried about losing my friends, fitting in a new school, but mostly about learning a new language. And here I want to say a little bit about how the Russian language was imposed upon people in former Soviet Union. It was not a choice, right? As soon as the second grade, one would have to learn Russian. Russian was something that was imposed. When I migrated to North America, learning about indigenous people's struggles, learning about Black people's struggles, learning about brown people's struggles made me feel closer to people of color than to any sort of whiteness or middle classness. My own experiences made me empathize with other marginalized groups. When I went to the interview in Moldova for migration, I was 19 years old. Since I was below 21 years of age, I interviewed with my parents. The interview took place in the US Embassy in Chisinau, which is the capital of Moldova. I remember it was a warm September day, and I took a day off from the university to attend this interview. None of my folks spoke English, so we were assigned a translator. When I arrived, the well-meaning translator advised me to change from shorts and t-shirt into a homely, quote-unquote, nice girl, dressed as to please the immigration officer. The purpose of the interview was for the immigration officer to assess the veracity of our refugee claim. My parents, in their 60s, were dressed in their Sunday best. The officer's first question pertained to my parents' claim of being my parents. He asked, quote, "Is she really your daughter, or are you her grandparents?" End quote. My mother rushed to ascertain that she had 6 children, and I was her quote-unquote miracle baby because there were pregnancy complications and she had me in her 40s. This answer seemed to please the immigration officer, whose opinion of women must have been that they should indeed have babies or die trying. After establishing that we were coming from a line of women who make children, the officer no longer concerned himself with my mother and I. At no point did the officer ask questions about religious persecution, which was the basis of our refugee claim. During Soviet times, members of the Protestant communities were indeed often imprisoned for up to 25 years for their religious beliefs. Instead, the officer asked my father, a preacher since his teenage years, to stand up and preach. Quote, "It says here, you're a preacher, Mr. Scolnic. Let's see it. Get up and preach." End quote. My father looked at the translator to make sure he understood, stood up slowly, asked for a Bible, and proceeded to preach. I do not remember what verses he read or how he analyzed it. However, I remember his downcast eyes, trembling hands, and the sinking feeling in my stomach. Then the officer's voice stopped. He had heard enough. We were told to leave the room. We'd know of his decision in the following days. I do not know how my father felt. We never spoke about it. Like me, he probably buried this humiliation somewhere deep within his consciousness. Looking back now, 15 years later, I was given access to the United States due to my father's performance of quote-unquote right Christianity and my mother's gendered functionality. In 2002, I acquired Canadian citizenship. The process works by filling out an online application, study and pass the citizenship test, thus proving one has the quote-unquote right knowledge of the Canadian state. It is not my intention to dwell on citizenship rules here. However, it is important to examine the content of the tested material on Canadian citizenship tests and the questions one gets asked during the exam. The epistemic violence within the citizenship test in Canada would have new citizens believe that this country has no history of genocide, slavery, racism, misogyny, and so on. What is worse is that it proclaims to have solved all those issues. The experience of my parents and I passing the interview 5 years earlier resurfaced in my memory when I took the Canadian citizenship test. One of the questions was a true or false statement that, to paraphrase, went like, quote, "European explorers created friendships with First Nations," end quote. This question made me question my ethics. Having had read the guide, I knew what the quote-unquote correct answer was. But I also have a PhD in sociology and know the history of these lands. During COVID-19, citizenship tests were done via a video-monitored online platform, where one is timed 30 minutes for an 18 multiple choice and true or false question test. I found the test fairly easy in terms of mental labor. One had to memorize certain white men's military ranks and socio-political positions, vestiges of colonial Canada. The test allows one to skip a question and come back to it when one is not sure of the correct answer. I answered all the questions except the aforementioned one. Having read the guide, I know what the expected answer was. However, I was also feeling the sinking feeling in my stomach and the urge to run to the bathroom and vomit. I still had 10 minutes on the clock. I was looking at myself within the video of the testing platform, and I was pondering, how much erasure do I do by answering quote-unquote right in order to be admitted into the realm of the Canadian state? And here's where the question of settler colonialism makes sense. By adhering to the Canadian state version of history, I am, as well, a participant in the ongoing violence against First Nations. And here is the literature as it pertains to whiteness. Not only academic literature, but also if you look at the arts and music and work that comes out of Eastern European countries today, Many youth, unlike me and my generation, decide to no longer leave. They decide to stay and try to work with the country as it is. There are enough stories by now that they know that living a life as a migrant is not necessarily going to be easier. And in this paper that I'm in the process of writing, I'm trying to basically participate in this discussion on whiteness and to be clear on the kind of choice Eastern Europeans have to make as it pertains to choosing either to adhere to an ideology of Western white colonial misogynistic ideology, or to actually remember our own stories of migration, how we're actually treated, how we're never actually accepted into this so-called whiteness, and with whom we should build solidarity. And in my opinion, again, this is with First Nations, Black peoples, Brown peoples, as well as building transnational solidarities. I think that migrants from different parts of the world should have these conversations. Indigenous peoples from different parts of the world should have these conversations. Formerly colonized peoples should have these conversations, not because our colonialisms have been the same, far from that, but because by finding similarities in our oppression, we can build solidarity. Thank you.